This book is a Trojan horse. This is about pushing nationalism, taking us backward to a time when the individual lone innovator, the person who takes new steps down roads no one else has gone down before, is subordinated to the collective, to the state, to the nation.
Silicon Valley has lost its way. This is how Alexander Karp and Elan Zamiska opened their book Technological Republic, a New York Times bestseller aspiring to provide a new vision for American business. Now, who are the authors? Alexander Karp is the founder and CEO of Palantir, a multi-billion-dollar software corporation, a corporation that has been working with the government on national defense technology. So Karp is someone who, when he talks, Silicon Valley listens. And the main thesis of the book is the following. Silicon Valley, we are told, has been focusing too much on projects that satisfy the personal ambitions of entrepreneurs and the consumerist desires of their customers, but projects that do nothing to address the biggest challenges the nation is facing. The authors claim that what America actually needs is a new paradigm where business and government work in harmony together to stay ahead of the curve of global power struggles. And this paradigm, i.e. the paradigm of business being an agent of a grand national project, is what gave America its glory days, we are told. And this is the paradigm, business and government together, that will make America great again. But is this the case? Today, in this bookshelf episode of the Undermining Institute podcast, we will claim that Technological Republic actually misdiagnoses what made American society the most productive in human history. We will also claim that it is actually the voice of a central planner echoing throughout the book. It's a collectivist voice that is actually un-American, and it's actually demeaning to the great producers and the great entrepreneurs. So, gentlemen, I'll begin by presenting some key points that the book is making, some points which actually sound plausible, and this explains why many people who see themselves as pro-business had a positive reaction to the book. So, Technological Republic, the book, highlights the need to be more ambitious on applying cutting-edge technology and artificial intelligence in the fields of, for example, of defense and of domestic and national security. Because the authors claims if we don't do it, our big antagonists like China, they will do it. And Silicon Valley, we're told, should be more involved in fields such as healthcare, education, law and order. And the book also encourages business leaders to grow a moral backbone and not cave to the pressure of what we could call woke orthodoxies. And the authors believe that our culture has been corroded by anti-Western sentiments, and it has been corroded by a moral relativism, which makes business leaders very hesitant to get involved with projects related, for example, to the defense of this country. So there are many themes already on the table. So let me start by asking our panelists. I'll start by you, Robertas. Let's start questioning the two main premises that the book is making and whether they are accurate. First of all, has Silicon Valley indeed shown a lack of dynamism lately? And is the way forward going back to an era where government and business joint action, like the one we saw around World War II with the Manhattan Project, was it indeed this cooperation, this coming together of the state and business that gave rise to American dynamism and American prosperity?
These are two big questions, so I'll try to be as brief as I can, and I know others will have to chip in. So that one question, I think, is it true that the rise of Silicon Valley, this unique place of innovation that's now is almost synonymous with innovation in America, and nowhere else in the world there is a place like that, is it true that there is some causal relationship with working on big national government-sponsored projects that gave rise to a place and the companies created in the place that now is this beacon of innovation? And the second question is like, that has something changed since like mid 20th century, and now that fountainhead of innovation that Silicon Valley is sort of dying out, or at least slowing down, according to a book. So the first question, I think, is, it's a really difficult question, because many arguments that can be presented there is many companies in Silicon Valley and technologies that come from Silicon Valley start from semiconductors and then the internet. It's true that in their first initial stages, in many of them, you can find some relationship with a government, some defense contracts, some contracts or funding from Defense Advanced Research Project Agency that contributed most likely to the development of stuff like internet and even personal computers, and especially semiconductors. But let me take this position in the book. It's a very big claim. And to make that claim, you would require a lot of evidence. And it would require a lot of tracing causal connections. You would have to go and prove and show step by step how a technology has been developed. And also, the second thing that you would have to do is to show a counterfactual, or at least a plausible counterfactual, that technology is dependent on that funding or government's contract, rather than is just accidental, or an aspect of a time and place rather than necessity, that technology wouldn't have developed or would have developed significantly differently without how it was. But there is no evidence, I think, presented, or it's really hard case to make. And I don't think in the book they go into much depth or even an attempt to present it, because think about a company like Fairchild Semiconductors. It's the 8 engineers who deserted, if you will, William Shockley, one of the people who is credited with founding, like developing such a thing as a semiconductor microchip. And they left, and they were one of the first companies that were established in a place that we now call Silicon Valley. And there is little evidence that you could say that they worked towards some collective purpose with the government. Yes, one of their first and major contracts was with the military, because military needed the computing technology for rockets and for calculation of what do you call them, trajectories. But very, very quickly, that company that was small military company doing military contracts shifted their attention towards consumer market and things like calculators and computers, because they realized that there is not much growth or development that we can do in this with only military contracts. What we need is to find where this technology that we're working on can be used most valuably and massively. And that was consumer markets. And that's when the big revolution happens. That's when the microchips and the semiconductors start being applied in every possible way that was unimaginable before. So again, I think it's a very difficult case to make. And the problem is not that they're not really trying to make that case. And I don't find evidence in the book for that.
Nikos, can I just jump in? Sorry, I think you're right that there's a lack of evidence for this very strong claim, and there might be a case to be made that this is part of the origin story of this place that's so uniquely innovative. I have a slightly different take on this, which is whatever that history might be, this book is a Trojan horse. It tries to set up a positive orientation that why can't we be more productive? Look at the past and here's the way forward. But in reality, when this wooden horse is opened, what you discover is that this book is dangerous. It is pushing an ideological agenda. And by ideological, I don't mean just its ideas divorced from reality. This is a political program, not really about innovation. This is about pushing nationalism, taking us backward to a time when the individual lone innovator, the person who takes new steps down roads no one else has gone down before, is subordinated to the collective, to the state, to the nation. And there is such a strong echo. It's more than an echo, in fact. This is about making innovators bow to the collective. And yes, we might have to go back, and I think there's an important historical question that you're bringing up, Robertas, that they don't meet. They don't meet this standard of evidence. I think the more salient point to me is that it's not the origin of Silicon Valley that's significant. It's where Silicon Valley what it's become since that time. So in the last, even if you just take the last 20 years or even the last 15 years, and the growth of companies like Facebook and Netflix and Apple's rebirth, because Apple was basically dead in the 90s. And if you think about Amazon and the growth of these companies, that is a story to be told. And it doesn't integrate with the story that Karp and Zamiska are trying to push. So to me, I just want to put that on the table. We can unpack this a bit more. But to me, this is a Trojan horse. It's really trying to sell us on, we're all interested in innovation. Here's the path forward. But reality here is they're trying to foist a really destructive political agenda through this positive seeming orientation.
Mike, before I get to you on your first thought, let me concretize a bit what Elan just said, because Elan, what you made is a strong argument. You made the case that the book oozes with this collectivistic vision, and because this might sound a bit too philosophical and too abstract to some of our to our audience, let me read you one line from the book, which I think exactly makes this point. So for those who have the book, it's from page 98, a short paragraph. The author say, quote, "We have made the mistake of allowing a technocratic ruling class to form and take hold in this country without asking for anything quite substantial in return. What should the public demand for abandoning the threat of revolt? The engineers and entrepreneurs of the Valley have been permitted vast licenses over broad swaths of the economy. But what should the public ask for in exchange? Free email is not enough." End of quote. So here we see, people, that this is indeed a very collectivistic vision. First of all, who is we? They talk about we have allowed. And what does allowed mean? Allowing entrepreneurs and allowing engineers to do their work means that they're not individuals who should enjoy freedom to pursue their own goals and to pursue their own dreams. It means that their freedom is conditional. Do they serve us properly? Then we might allow them some freedom. But the moment when they don't deliver what the common good expects from them to deliver, whatever this common good is, then we can revoke this privilege. According to this vision, these entrepreneurs do not have rights, they have privileges. And these privileges can be revoked if the public isn't properly, quote unquote, served. So what you said, Elan, is not just your evaluation, it's something that the authors openly mention. And I could have chosen many other quotes which oozes this idea that the entrepreneur is there to serve us, is not someone who has his own dreams, his own aspirations, and he who should have the freedom to pursue them. Mike.
Yeah, so part of the reason to think that there's some kind of Trojan horse going on here, that they have a political agenda it's not just about understanding productivity, is like the plausibility of some of the examples they use. I think if you reflect on and know a little bit about the examples, are completely not just implausible as stated, but that the agenda they're advocating is actually going to undermine the technological innovations that they say they value. So take Robertas's example of the early semiconductor industry. So a lot of the technology that made, for example, the Intel 4004, one of the early consumer microchips, possible, came out of the Apollo program and DARPA initiatives. And look at the direction of those two. I mentioned the Apollo program. So look at the direction of the aerospace and space launch industry in contrast to the consumer electronics industry. One was centrally planned, a giant national project of the sort that Karp and his co-author admire. That's the space program. and the other is the consumer which they can constantly put down consumer products throughout the book. And the rate of progress in consumer electronics is just, if you just track it over the course of the last 50 years, is unbelievable how much better things are now. And then year to year, versus the progress or lack of progress in the aerospace industry and in the space launch industry. After the Apollo program wrapped up, who cares about what happened in space? Nobody. Nothing interesting, exciting, revolutionary. No one's lives are changed by it. I mean, you have some better satellites, and that ties into consumer electronics eventually. But that's a versus the rate of progress in consumer electronics. And that's what happens when you have central planning and grand national projects. You get maybe some flashy thing at the beginning, and then just stagnation or retrogression. And the industries that why isn't Silicon Valley more involved in education and all these other things they name? Those are things that already have central planning aspects, and they don't work out, and they're blind to that.
Let's make it a bit more specific. What is their problem with all these, let's say, consumerist products? If we dig under the surface, what is the beef that the authors have with what we could call gadgets or apps? And the problem they have is that these are things that by design serve each individual in his own, what they consider narrow pursuits, and they do not serve a greater good. Let me give one particular example from the book. They talk about Steve Jobs, and indeed they recognize him as a revolutionary creator. But here's the catch. So this is from page 124. Quote, Steve Jobs' revolution, however, was essentially intimate and personal. His principal focus was on constructing the products, including the mobile phones that now coexist with us on our person throughout our lives, that would liberate the individual from reliance on a corporate or governmental superstructure. My commentary here, they mentioned this as something suspicious. Continuing with the quote. And he did. His interest, Steve Jobs' interest, was not in building the means to advance a broader American or national project, or in enabling a closer collaboration between the technology industry and the state. A bit later, the products that Jobs and Apple built were focused on the power and creativity of the individual mind, and as a result were extensions, often literally in the form of phones, wristwatches, personal computers, extensions of the self. And here you have it, people. There's too much selfishness, there's not too much common good orientation, and this is what Silicon Valley has produced. Too much concern with ourselves, and this is why Silicon Valley should be viewed with suspicion according to the book. So this is the problem with the gadgets, gentlemen. They make us too selfish. Who has something to comment on this?
I just wanted to bring something up that we talked about before we started recording, and this has a mirror image. So this is the failing of Silicon Valley. It's too oriented to the consumer, to the self, to the individual. And in their mind, what's missing is an orientation to something above and beyond and external to the self. And here they mean the nation. And one example of the kinds of things that they think is missing is what Palantir does, which is have contracts with the government and national security projects and military hardware and so forth. And that, I think there's a place for that. So it's not the case that that's illegitimate or anything like that, but there's certainly a case for that. But they seem completely perplexed that anybody else would have trepidation working with the government, and that they would have suspicion about how their technology would be used. And they cite cases of Amazon, I think IBM canceling contracts with the government because of those kinds of worries. And Robertas, I'm interested in your perspective on this, because I think there's something worth talking about, because there is a phenomenon here. Companies have shied away, they have canceled contracts. But what's your take on that aspect of the book?
Well, I think part of is the aspect of the assumption in the book of why are companies shining away. And Nikos mentioned a little bit, and you, Elan, already mentioned a little bit about that. So there are examples they use as Google and Amazon, and how sometimes even employees just rise against the management to sort of boycott contracts with the government that would provide military technology and advancements in software to the government. And the assumption in the book is sort of, well, it's either they don't value America or they don't understand that what they're doing is ultimately undermining their own freedom to produce the consumer gadgets or whatever they want, because their freedom, in the argument in the book, is relies on a strong, powerful, dominant American military that sort of pushes away any threats from the people in Silicon Valley and everyone else in America who can sort of live in their naive world of peace without knowing what goes into maintaining that peace and freedom. And that's sort of the assumption of I think, Elan, I want to ask you how to challenge that assumption too properly. But there is just the issue of, well, that's obviously not the only alternative. There is a very easy counter case that you at least have to consider, and it doesn't appear in the book. And it's, well, if I am concerned about how the technology will be used, and I know cases like the scandal that Edward Snowden of intelligence and surveillance of American people that he made public, or I have views about how American military behaved and failed in places like Vietnam or Afghanistan, or treating threats to America like the terrorism after 2001. And ARI has done a lot of work on explaining how America didn't respond properly to 2001 and didn't eliminate the threats. And some Americans might have views that we still have threats and that our government is not doing the right things. Why would we give them the work with them or give them additional power and technological might if we don't believe that they're doing the right things? So my point is, there's this obvious case of reasoning that might be happening in the people who refuse to work with the government or take government contracts, and it's taken completely not even grappled with in the book. And I think you have to grapple with all plausible explanations if you are honest about what you're doing.
Yeah, it's almost like the people who don't do what Palantir does are subject to some kind of dogma, anti-government dogma. They're anti-American because they're not interested in securing the homeland. And maybe that's true for some people who object. But I think, as you're pointing out, Robertas, I think that there are valid reasons, at least, to raise questions or concerns or suspicions about what government would be doing with technology, particularly since once you hand it over or sell it or contract it to the government, you don't have control over it. And we have enough history of American policy being irrational that you would be worried, including with respect to domestic policy. So I think the fact that they don't grapple with this, to me, suggests, and here I'm speculating because there isn't enough in the text to justify this, but the way I read it is, who are you to ask these questions? The government's going to make these decisions, and your job is to make technology that supports that. And that's part of being patriotic. And my reaction to that, if that's actually the animating premise, that's not what it means to be patriotic. What it means to be patriotic is to be concerned with what is the true nature of America, what are the principles that justify it. And in the answers I would offer are that it protects individual freedom, including of innovators especially. And that means freedom and not being subject to the collective, not being beholden to the nation state in the way these authors are pushing. So to me, this is a big disappointment in the book, because they're raising a really important question. And there are questions about what Palantir does, and they don't grapple with any of that. They don't grapple with the questions that someone might reasonably raise. And that, I think, makes their position that much less tenable.
And you mentioned how the entrepreneur is not to be trusted. But at the end of the day, according to this vision, even the public is not to be trusted, because the public, the consumers, as they call them, also have these selfish whims, so to speak, this individualist inclination, just in the same way as the producers do. So in the way of in the worldview of the author, there needs to be someone who can rise above both the consumers and the producers with their narrow interest and see the big picture. In other words, what is needed is a central planner. And again, I want to give one more last quote from my side from the book. The reason we give these quotes is we want to make sure that if you haven't read the book, you get an idea about what the book is about, and also that our points are based on what the authors themselves say. So listen to these lines from the book. These are from page 196. Quote, "But why must we always defer to the wisdom of the crowd when it comes to allocating scarce capital in a market economy? We seem to have unintentionally deprived ourselves, going back to the quote, of the opportunity to engage in a critical discussion about the business and endeavors that ought to exist, not merely the ventures that could." And then he gives some examples of some business which apparently they're not so meaningful, and continue with the quote, "Tens of billions of dollars were wagered on their continued ascent. But there was no forum or platform or meaningful opportunity for anyone to question whether our society's scarce resources ought to be diverted to the construction of online games or a more effective aggregator of coupons and discounts. The market has spoken, so it must be so." So again, here we see people, the vision that someone needs to tell people what to do. And I think this is a very left-wing vision, first of all. So these people, I'm sure they wouldn't recognize themselves as such. But this idea that there are these scarce resources that somehow probably grow on trees, and then these greedy entrepreneurs come and grab these resources, this is a very, I would call it socialist point of view. It's a point of view that mostly is there with the left. And the fact that people who are indeed within the Silicon Valley, people who have produced, people who should know better how businesses work, the fact that they give this, I would call it primitive view that there are these resources and we need to allocate them. To me, this is very, very disappointing. And I think that only their political agenda, an agenda that sees individual initiative as something which is to be seen with skepticism, it is only this that blinds them, and they can make these huge, in my view, errors of judgment.
If Karp wants more technology companies to work with the United States government, he should do exactly what he did, which is take his own resources and persuade other people with resources to start a company and work with the United States government. Capital is not a scarce resource that's just out there. As he should know from his own experience in the technology sector, it's created by investors and people who found and run successful companies. And it's, one of the things that's really frustrating about the book, like, what makes something like Palantir or another company similar to Palantir, Andrew, which makes more hardware, not software, what makes all of these possible is that over the last 20-something, maybe a little further back years, there was a self-conscious move in the Department of Defense away from the kind of entrenched technology providers that had sort of special contracts that they could sort of milk the government for more than they should, to engaging with a market of defense contractors rather than having just like Lockheed Martin and Boeing as the two they go to. There's a very interesting book called Unit X on this this development, and it's because of that expansion and embrace of markets and freedom, in this case the kind of open bidding on contracts, that makes those startups possible, like Andrew and Palantir. And I mean, now that Karp has his success, what does he want to close the gates on everyone else, and maybe he wants to take control over the industry? I don't know about that, but it seems plausible as one of the motivations behind this, that the people who advocate these kind of views often see themselves as taking the very power they're advocating. So there's a respect in which the whole argument of the book is self-defeating. That is, what makes the kind of technological progress Karp and his co-author say they value possible is the very market structure they're drawing under criticism and eyeing with suspicion.
And one last point I want to make here, gentlemen. The authors, rightly, again, they want to stand up to the un-American culture that has taken over business, as they claim. A culture that we could call wokeness or the social justice ideology. However we call it, we understand what we're talking about. This culture, the peak of which we saw around in the summer of 2020 with Black Lives Matter, the riots, and all these companies trying to appease this movement. But my question is this: are the authors actually suggesting a new vision, a vision which is radically different from what we could call woke? Or are they suggesting more of the same? Because let's think about it. What did the woke mobs request from businesses in 2020? The argument was that entrepreneurs should work for something bigger than their individual self-interest. They should work for something bigger than their profits. They should go and pursue social justice. This was the message of woke. Don't work only for profit, work also for social justice. But here is the vision that the technological republic offers, supposedly alternative vision. Entrepreneurs should work for something bigger than their individual interest and their profits. They should go and pursue a common good nationalism or a common good national project. So the only thing changing is what is the group that the entrepreneurs should be the servants of. For the woke left, the entrepreneurs should be the servants of the minorities. But for the technological republic, it is the common good of the nation that entrepreneurs should serve. So both the woke and the authors of the technological republic, they seem to agree on the fundamental. And the fundamental is that the entrepreneur, the producer, is to be a servant working for, quote, something bigger than himself. So, Elan, at the end of the way, this doesn't, at the end of the day, this doesn't look to me as a radical alternative to woke. It seems to me as a reaction to woke, sharing the same premises with woke.
I agree. I don't think there's anything original here. That's the other kind of disappointment about this book. I would have thought, I think that Karp himself is quite well read. I heard him speak on a podcast. He seems highly educated and really informed. And I expected more original thinking here, more first-handed thinking. And I think that's what's missing in that. I think your characterization is fair, that this is just a changing of the direction, but the same basic assumption that the individual belongs to the collective in some sense. I would add another way in which this is unoriginal and, in fact, highly conventional, which is, if one is familiar with some of the trends in the conservative movement, this is something you've been studying, the sort of the new right, so-called, and the national conservatives are one faction of the new right. And I've written about them. We've done podcasts about the new right and the national conservatives in particular. Many things that Karp and his co-authors say in the book are from the national conservative playbook. So, for example, there's too much focus on classical liberalism and the preference of individual, they call it the preference for individual rights, as if it's a preference as opposed to a political principle that has grounds in a moral view of life. And that there's a fetishization of the individual. You gave the quote about how Steve Jobs pushed Apple to make products that are very personal. They sit on your wrist, they sit in your pocket, they're at your desk, on your lap. And that demeaning of the individual, like the devaluing of the individual, is very much a hallmark of the national conservatives. Another hallmark is this idea that belief in religion or faith in general is something that's being attacked and marginalized in society. And because of that, we are left with this sort of nihilistic view from the left. And there's something to that dynamic, but it's not really getting at the fundamental of what's going on. and what it really comes across as is special pleading for, we need more room for faith. Faith needs to have a higher status in society, which is definitely something that comes through in the book. I think the other thing I would say is coming out of the national conservative sort of playbook is what unites some of the discussion we've had so far, which is this idea that national identity is a really big issue that we need to coalesce around. And national identity, they claim, again, like the national conservatives, it's not about ethnicity. It's something that most people can join. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's what really comes out of this. And it's the way in which they tiptoe around what we know about collectivism in different forms through history. So they acknowledge that, yes, people have taken collectivism too far, and it has had a bloody history. And they quote a German scholar who was critical about how Germany was processing its past with the Holocaust, which I found that whole section really disturbing. It's as if, yeah, here's a guy in Germany who's saying we've already done everything we need to do to acknowledge what's happened in the past. Let's move on. There's something really disturbing in bringing that up here. So there's this idea of, let's resurrect this idea of nationalism. Let's whitewash it or wash away its bloody past and pretend like, yeah, if you just if you dial it in right, you get enough of it, it doesn't go bad, which is really a misunderstanding of what nationalism is. And the premise of the book, more broadly, this collectivism that they advocate, it's either conscious misunderstanding or an unwillingness to acknowledge it, or they haven't done their homework. So to me, this is another way in which what's being put forward here is rooted in or highly influenced by the national conservative type perspective on life. And that's to me sad, because that is a destructive political ideological movement. And anyone who's really concerned with innovation, who's really spending time to write about what's good about Silicon Valley, what's good about technology, what's good about entrepreneurial work, which is so distinctive to the United States. If you spend all that time and this is where you land, I think you've lost your way. So it's not Silicon Valley that's lost its way. It's Karp and his co-author. They really haven't thought enough about what are the conditions that enable innovators and entrepreneurs and the remnants of capitalism, of which the tech industry enjoys a significant amount of freedom, probably the freest industry in our society. That doesn't come up enough in the book. And so to me, it's a betrayal of the people that they are claiming to lionize and speak for and to rally. So this book is supposed to be a rallying cry for bringing technology back into the centerpiece of our society. It is not anything like that. In fact, it's a slap in the face at anyone who's ever built an app, because I think whatever app it is, it's an achievement. Anyone who's built a company, anyone who's really put in the effort to build and create and produce. And that's the sense in which fundamentally this book is not just unoriginal, it's just recycling the same demeaning insults to the world's innovators.
It captures a moment, though, Elan. It rides on the zeitgeist. It rides on the cultural moment, which is the cultural moment where nationalism and collectivism are the big thing on the right.
But Nikos, that moment is also, that moment that they're capturing is also undermining their own claim. So think about it this way. We just reviewed a while ago another book in a bookshelf, Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, who are arguably on the opposite side of a political or social views spectrum than Karp and Zamiska. They're definitely on the left and explicitly so. And in their book, it's fascinating to me how similar it is, because they say, look, the reasons they discuss are different, so I will not go into, but one of the problems is they're like, look, we need to direct entrepreneurs and builders and ambitious people, those who are capable of building software, and they're now focusing on the Silicon Valley consumerism and apps and all of that. They should be directed in some way to producing things more like housing and healthcare and education and infrastructure, the things that matter in Klein's and Thompson's view for the future of America, for the future and wealth and prosperity. And of course, the solution, well, how should we do that? And it amounts to, look, we need to big national government projects, less restricted with some private interests, to go and build in these great industries and fields that we find fundamental. Again, housing, healthcare, housing, infrastructure. And then, okay, so if Karp says we need to focus our efforts in big national projects in military, let's say, and Klein says, no, we want these big projects in housing. Well, how are they going to fight it out? The market, they decided, or both decided, the left and the right, they decided the market leads people to focus on their individual well-being and lives and not on some collective national big purpose. But the national big purpose obviously there is not one. And how will they be fighting in deciding which to pursue? And of course, they don't really go into that in the book, because if they did, they would have to recognize that, well, it's going to be some form of political pull, some form of authoritarianism, some form of control, and ultimately diminishing of people's freedom more and more to decide what they want to put their lives to and resources and efforts to. But they can't explicitly acknowledge that, because they know they will just lose their audience. But again, the point is not original. Basically the same message as in the left, no recognition of that conflict, and just avoiding the problem that the whole supposed argument faces.
The most plausible problem that they raise is the unwillingness of many people in the technology sector to work with the military and the police function of the state. And I mean, that's a problem that goes back, to the early part of the 20th century. It was dramatized a little bit in the movie Oppenheimer, where he had trouble recruiting people for the Manhattan Project because some of them were communists, socialists, pacifists. So they had very philosophical reasons not to want to work with the American government. And the fix for that is to advocate for, and with maybe people in the sciences as an audience, the value of freedom. And the United States, why is America good and worth defending? Because it's a free society. It's in its founding committed to that as a founding principle. It's been overall, we can of course complain about specific mistakes, but overall been a force for freedom in the world in the long term, and still is. And to communicate to that to the people in the sciences that's a reason to want to work with the United States military as the instrument of securing that freedom. But if you actually implemented the things that Karp and his co-author are advocating, you no longer have a free society worth defending. And there's no longer a rational reason to want to work with that government. So that's to just recapitulate a point I made earlier. That's a way in which this whole, if you take their best case example of the problem of Silicon Valley not wanting to engage with the military, it's very self-undermining. Why is America worth defending? Because it's a free society, and they're advocating that it abandon that.
But also an argument. Yeah, Robertas.
I want to add one more, push it a little more. Why is then a free society worth defending also? And like, if that question was asked seriously, why do we want people to be free and go pursue their lives as they see fit without an intervention of a government of other people? Well, so that they can pursue happiness, they can make their choices, what career to pursue, what gadgets or apps to use, what art to consume, how to build their lives, and what meaning to attach to their lives. That's part of what free society gives you, is the individual makes a decision of how to lead his life rather than serves some collective purpose determined for him. And then in the book, you would find something like claims that they say, yeah, the West is distinguished from, or American, the West is distinguished from other history or countries in the world by protecting individual rights. And that's important. But for them, that's not enough, because that's not enough to rally people around a collective purpose. But that's the point. The point of individual rights in the free society is that people don't get rattled together into of some collective goal. Yeah, that's the whole point. And now I want to stress this disdain for individual lives and happiness that comes implicitly from the book. Like they say in a quote, when we talk, and I will say one more thing, which is absurd, I think. They say that with Silicon Valley today, we have, quote, the age of social media platforms and food delivery apps. But medical breakthroughs, education reform, and military advances would have to wait, they say. So there's two things. One is this disdain. You people enjoy your life, your social connections, your delicious food that comes to you build your lives around this, around pleasures, and you choose your careers, you Silicon Valley. How dare you choose what you want to work on? This disdain for individual decision and what happiness means and how people build happy lives. And also this absurd claim or a premise that we have in a book that there was no breakthroughs in important fields in the last 20, 30 years. And I think it's important that it takes 5 minutes of research to sometimes see how absurdly and nonsensical claims in the books are. So for example, medical breakthroughs. We can argue a lot about how slow the medicine has become because of how involved government is and the Federal Drug Administration slowing down the process of development. But even in this case, think about what Silicon Valley technology and developed in Silicon Valley meant for medicine. And think about a company like Epic Systems that created the software to connect all personal medical records across, for hundreds of millions of people and hospitals and the billing systems, which arguably you could definitely make a case, and there is some research on that a software like that puts data, and now that data that can be put into AI algorithms to analyze and extract more benefit, that data of medical records, of medical cases so you can transfer data from one place to another, doctors can learn from each other, research can be done on that data, created just through software, might have advanced the health and the medicine much more than some separate innovation like a robotic surgery, let's say. So to disdain software or software in education, one is it's pretty absurd in a book to claim that, look, entrepreneurs should have, where is the education reform, they say in a book? What does it have to do with Silicon Valley? Education, it's a political question determined by both the states and the federal government. But even then, how much software coming from the Silicon Valley has improved education? We here at ARI, we run an online school through Zoom and podcasts and YouTube. This podcast is a YouTube educational podcast. COVID lockdown, all people in the whole country were, not to say the lockdown, and it was a good decision, but every kid could only continue for education through software, through the online, through access to cheap software like MacBook hardware, thanks to Apple and Google and Samsung, and thanks to software like Zoom and others. So it's just a few minutes of research gives you lists and lists of developments and breakthroughs in medicine, like MRI diagnostics, LASIK. I will not go into the list, but I have a full list of some interesting developments in medical technology in the last 20 years. But the point is, in the book, they just say, look, there was none. Take us for our word. There was no improvements in military or medical technology in the last 20, 30 years. We will not tell you why or how so. Just take this for granted and believe us. And I think that's disrespectful to the reader. And that's disrespectful that points that it's not an argument that they care about, but the agenda that they're trying to put forward on.
I just want to sharpen that point because it ties into the philosophical analysis that we've been unfolding here, which is, I think if we had a conversation with both of the co-hosts as we brought them onto this podcast and we asked them, what do you know about this? What do you know? And they would know about some of the things you've talked about. And I think it's unlikely, in my view, that they are unaware. Why does it not come up, and why do they dismiss it? Why doesn't it even come to their mind as they're writing the book? And I think it's revealing of their value framework, their sort of collectivized perspective, their nationalist view that unless it's serving the collective good in some way that they recognize, it's serving some abstract sense of something higher than the individual, they're not interested. And if it's serving individuals as individuals, or health benefits, and your child gets to continue learning things on YouTube when you're forced to lock down, or just you can learn so many things on YouTube and it is an educational platform from a certain perspective, they don't care about that because they don't care about individuals as individuals. Individuals to the collectivists are not real. this is the sense in which they're not real. They can see people, they can see you and me and Nikos and Mike, but we're not real. What's real in their mind is some organic being, some nation, some collective, and all value resides in that, whatever that thing is. It's not a real thing, but that is sort of this make-believe fiction. And if individual benefits, okay, well, it's just you. You have an iPhone in your pocket. That makes your life immeasurably better than it was 20 years ago. We don't really care about that. That doesn't serve the collective. And this is the sense in which collectivism is such a destructive outlook on life, which is it devalues the individual. It makes the individual unreal in a value sense, because it's metaphysically, like, there is no such thing as an individual in their mind. You're just a fragment of a whole. And that is the ultimate insult. And this is the sense, and I was just sharpening your point by saying, this is an injustice towards business in general, innovators in particular, and entrepreneurs even more specifically, the kind of people that rub shoulders with these authors when they meet up at various places like South by Southwest and all these Silicon Valley gatherings, where the people who should be lionized and celebrated are in effect insulted and demeaned and devalued in this book. And I think that's, to me, that's one of the things that's so aggravating, is that finishing the book, I thought, first of all, I can't believe this is what they wrote. It's such a disappointment. And I often think about who are heroes to me in this space. So people like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, or even going back through history, people like Edison. If you told me, yeah, Edison, you didn't work with the government enough, so nothing that you do really matters. Really? Or Steve Jobs, yeah, you didn't pipe Apple into the government. You don't count. What you achieve doesn't matter. And that's just, it's so warped. And I think that's the sense in which there's an ulterior purpose here, and it has to be exposed.
Hope we did a good job in presenting the main premise of the book. While, Robertas, you were saying how it's preposterous to say there has been no progress in medicine. Of course, we'd want it to be 10x faster, but I was just thinking how a couple of years ago, an uncle of mine, relatively quite old, his wearable saved his life. It gave him an early warning about some arrhythmia type of thing, and he rushed to the hospital, and it probably saved his life. So even these quote-unquote gadgets that they seem so snobbish about them. And again, look, the direct link between freedom and life. Someone thought, oh yeah, this wearable, it's a cool idea. And through this, people's life became better. Life would be better even if it hadn't saved his life, literally saved his life. The mere fact that he has something that he enjoys and he likes, this is good enough reason. And the fact that someone wants to create something, to go after something, that's the whole meaning of life. That's why we need freedom, as you, Roberta, says, to pursue beautiful things, to pursue our dreams.
So, Nikos, when I finished reading this book, one thought I had is that for every person who's made this a bestseller, who's eager to hear what Alex Karp has to say about the future of a technological republic, I wish every one of those people had a chance to read Atlas Shrugged, because that's a much deeper appreciation of what it takes to be an innovator, what goes into it, and the moral significance of production. And the other thought I had is this is underlining the value of the project the Institute launched recently, the Atlas Circle, which exists to stand up for business and to help business stand up for itself on moral terms.
The book was The Technological Republic, Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West. The authors, Alexander Karp and Nikos Zamiska. This has been a bookshelf episode of the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. Please subscribe, comment, share if you find value if you found value in this. All these are quite important for us. And if you have comments, or if there's another book you would want us to review, you can send your suggestions at newideal@aynrand.org. Many thanks to my co-panelists. Many thanks to you for your time. All the best.